Here are my 5 people. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The war on drugs is a complete failure. The war on drugs is the most costly and least effective war that the U.S. has fought. Personally, for me, if you're going to define a war has to have an end in sight, and the war on drugs has no end in sight. It, it's going to go on forever until drugs are legalized. It's never going to end. The U.S. spent $20 billion so far this year on the war on drugs. This includes raids, police, DEA, and other things that they use for the war on drugs. This statistic comes from the Office of Drug Control Policy. Between 1980 and 1997, the incarceration rates for drug-related offenses rose from 50,000 to 400,000. This means that in between this time, something had to happen, and it was the war on drugs. They really cracked down on the illicit drug use and incarcerating people for using drugs. With the war on drugs also comes black markets and the underground drug dens. The prohibition causes the prices to skyrocket. When the drugs start out in a third world country and when they finally make it to the U.S., the profits, they increase exponentially. In a third world country, it could be this amount, and then once it gets to the U.S., it's some crazy amount. Which, when you have profit like that, it leads to, people are money hungry. It's going to create competition. It's going to create people killing each other over the profit. They all want the money. This with this increased competition, it's a cheap way to make money, which is why people like it. There's not much you really have to do other than sell it once it gets here. So it's like, it's high profit, low risk, except for going to prison. But with the war on drugs also comes violence. The violence extends from the third world countries, like the cartel and other, third world countries or third world organizations. And it comes over into the U.S., which leads to, more violence in our streets. People are killing each other over these drugs, and really, it wouldn't be as bad if the profit wasn't as high. And the only reason it's so high is because of the war on drugs. It really creates the profit. And if there were no profit, then there would be less crime. I wouldn't say there wouldn't be any crime or any drugs, but it would be marginally less. With the war on drugs, politics is also a big factor. It's the biggest driving force for the war on drugs. The war helps keep many DEA agents and law enforcement officers in their jobs, but I believe that even if the DEA officers and law enforcement who dealt with the drugs lost their jobs, it would be a lot better than putting hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens in jail just for drug use or drug possession. Politics also ties into the prison profit portion of the war on drugs. Many people don't know, but people make a lot of money off keeping people in prison. War on drugs also deals with human rights issues. There's a law in New York called the stop and frisk, where someone can be they can be standing on the street corner doing nothing, not violating any laws, and they can be stopped and frisked, and if they have drugs on them, even if they weren't doing anything or illegally selling them, then they could be detained and charged for that. Which, to me, I think that's a direct correlation between the war on drugs and human rights violations. Because someone standing on a street doesn't mean that you can just walk up and search them, Also with human rights, I think, how can you tell someone, or how can someone tell another person what they can put in their body, and how can you make a law against that? That seems weird to me. When, if you intake a drug and you go commit a crime, I think that would be, reason to arrest someone if they committed a crime, but I don't believe that taking drugs would be a crime. Prisons also play a large role in the war on drugs. The biggest reason for no reform in the war on drugs is because of the profit that people make off of the prisons. They make profit off of people being imprisoned, and over 50% of people in prison are there because of drug-related charges. Prisons also offer no treatment for drug addicts or people with an illness in prison. So basically, they get charged with something and they go into prison, and then they get no treatment, so they go out. So what does a person with an illness do when they get no treatment? They go right back to what they used to do because they don't know any better. I think that treatment would also really help reoffending rates, but I don't think that will happen. Treatment is also a more cost-effective plan than imprisonment. Until prisons are reformed to incorporate better treatment options or treatment plans for people with addiction, there's not much that can be done. Lastly, I think we need to treat people with a drug issue and not demonize them and imprison them. They're human beings. They're not there for profit. We need to provide them with support and not a jail cell. Here's my 5 people.